Is the driving test scary? Is it scary like a horror movie? No. Is it scary like you really, really want to pass and the person sitting next to you gets to decide your fate? Hell yes. And I remember when I did my driving test, I really, really wanted to pass. It meant the world to me. It meant everything to me. So yes, that made it downright scary. So what do we actually mean by the word scary? Well, scary means afraid. It means anxious. It can mean frightened. It implies anything that's setting that fight or flight response. So why is the driving test scary? What actually makes it scary? There's a huge number of reasons and it's different from person to person. So let's start with the basics. You've probably spent thousands of pounds preparing for this driving test. That's going to be on driving lessons. That's going to be on your own car. Maybe that's just on insurance. You put huge amounts of money into this learning process. You've also put huge amounts of time. Let's face it, you've probably spent 40+ hours doing this. They are precious hours. If you're on £10 an hour, that's at least £400 worth of time alone. And you've put huge amounts of motivation to carry you through this, because let's face it, learning to drive is hard. It is hard work. It takes a hell of a lot of effort to drag yourself to that lesson every time, especially at the beginning. And then you start reading horror stories online or Facebook or TikTok about the examiner, the driving test situation. You went the wrong way. None of it helps. What are some other reasons that make it scary? Well, I had one student that went for an interview. They got the job, but only if they passed the driving test in the next 2 months. Talk about pressure. And it was their dream job. That makes a driving test scary. On top of that, you've told everyone about the driving test. Everyone around you expects you to pass. Imagine a balloon, pump that balloon up full of pressure. That's like your head. Keep pumping that pressure in there. It gets harder and harder until eventually, boom. So we've got the expectation of everyone wanting us to pass. And then to make matters even worse, we've got to pay over £120 for that day, maybe 62 for the test, and then whatever it costs for your driving lesson. And then to make matters even worse, you know, if you don't pass, there could be a 6-month wait for another test. We can see why the driving test might start to sound a little bit scary. And with that in mind, can you tell me in the comments, what is your main fear of the driving test? Is it the examiner? Is it the test itself? Is it the build up to the test? Pop it in the comments, let me know. So according to the AA, 87% of people going for their driving test actually feel scared. They feel nervous about going for their test. So if you are, the first thing to remember is you're not the only one out there. Let's talk about the examiners, because that's normally a big issue when you're going for your driving test. Honestly, they're just people like you, me, mum and dad. They go home, they eat, they chat with the family, they go to sleep. Some are chatty, some are quiet. That doesn't mean they don't like you. That doesn't mean they've even thought about you. All they're trying to do is their job. And don't get me wrong, they will take their job very seriously. And what is the examiner's job? The examiner's job is to make sure you are a safe and competent driver on the road. You're not going to be a hazard to yourself or to anyone else out there. And as I said before, they will take their job very, very seriously, because at the end of the day, they're putting their name against you. If you were to go out after your driving test because they passed you when they shouldn't have and you cause an accident, that's going to come down to them. And my main tip with the examiner is try not worry about talking to the examiner or the examiner talking to you. And for some people, that's easy. They don't want to talk. They just want to focus ahead. But if anyone's like me, bit of a people pleaser, my brother's also a people pleaser, having a quiet examiner in your passenger seat is going to be quite off-putting. But trying to force that examiner into talking is only going to make the matters worse. Now, I use this specific example because my brother passed his driving test on his 3rd attempt. Why, you might ask? Because on his first 2 attempts, he was too busy trying to make friends with the examiner. It was only on the 3rd attempt he realised he needed to ignore the examiner because the examiner doesn't need any new friends. The examiner needs to get back and have a coffee. And you need your driving license. On his 3rd attempt, he realized this, focused solely on the road and passed his driving test because he wasn't making mistakes trying to people please and make friends with the examiner. Are nerves actually a bad thing? Well, being nervous can help to some extent. It keeps you super focused, faster reactions, you're going to stay more alert. Your decision making is going to be at peak performance. There's been a number of politicians, astronauts, actors out there that have said they've used their nerves to actually help them achieve a goal that they wanted to achieve. But there is a point where nerves turned into something far, far worse. And this is when they go so far and they start turning into anxiety, they start to distract us, they cloud our judgment. They make us make those silly mistakes where we go in the wrong lane on a roundabout and take the wrong turning that we shouldn't have turned. And this is what then can lead us to fail a driving test. The question is, how can we help control this? In order to understand this, first we're going to need a very basic lesson about ourselves. And me being a science teacher in my past life, I'm going to share with you right now. The nervous system that we have has two parts. The first part is called the sympathetic nervous system. This is the part that takes over in any scary situations, those fight or flight situations. If you've ever been on a driving lesson, you've got yourself a bit panicky, that's your sympathetic nervous system taking over, the fight or flight mode. Really, really useful when we're in a dangerous situation, when we need to get out of there or deal with a situation. Not so good on a driving test, because it's going to cause anxiety, it's going to cause all those things we've already talked about. We're going to refer to this as the fight or flight mode. The second part is the parasympathetic nervous system. And this is the part that keeps us calm, collective. Yo, dude, we're all good. We're in control. We're going to name this part the calm nervous system. Now, for the driving test, our real sweet spot will be able to turn off the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight mode, because this is not going to help us control ourselves. It's not going to help us focus. It could potentially cloud judgment, and this is what often leads to driving test fails. So, here are 3 ways to help you control your nerves. Number 1, this has many names, but they all mean the same thing. The army are taught to use it. Any high stress situation, you will be taught to use this. It's known as mindful breathing, tactical breathing. It has lots of names, but they all mean the same thing. And it comes down to controlling your breathing. And you might think, well, Josh, I breathe constantly. And yes, you do. But what you may start to notice next time you get into a panicky situation is that actually you're breathing shallower. You're breathing faster and shallower. And this signals to your brain to say, fight or flight mode, let's panic. And we can't help going into this mode sometimes. But what we do want to try and do is recognize it and get back out of it as quickly as possible. The best way to do this is to first of all recognize it and then start to send signals to our brain to say, get out of fight or flight and get back to calm. And the best way to do this is to forcibly start slowing our breathing down by taking deeper, longer breaths. Now, there's loads of ways you can do this. If you search online mindful breathing, but here is one particular way that I use and I've always used, and it's always been very beneficial for me. First thing you need to do is breathe in for 2 seconds, hold for 2 seconds, then breathe out for 2 seconds. You then want to repeat this, but instead for 3 seconds. Breathe it in for 3, hold for 3, breathe out for 3. Again, repeat this, but for 4 seconds, and then repeat it again for 5 seconds. If you're still feeling anxious, you can continue to do this for as long as it takes for your brain to recognize that you need to come out of panic mode. Now, in the past, if I'd heard anything like this, I would have thought this is some mumbo jumbo right here. And then I got myself into a particularly panicky situation, and I continued to get myself very anxious for the next few weeks. So I started to try this, and after some practice, I soon realized this was really, really helping me get back out of that mode. As I mentioned before, it does take practice. So don't expect to do it once and then the whole world is this perfect rainbow. The second one is to focus on how we're thinking. When we start to get anxious, we start to focus on some of the more negative thoughts. So in relation to the driving test, all you might be thinking is, I'm going to fail this driving test. I'm going to pass them a second time. What happens if I fail and I can't get a test for 6 months? What happens if my driving examiner's not very nice? Sending these messages up to the brain then sends messages down to the nervous system, and guess what? You start to get panicky, you start to get the sweats, you start to breathe faster. And this leads to increased anxiety, increased nerves, la 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 la, and it all goes downhill from there. So how do we combat this? The best way to combat this is to start sending some positive messages. Now, don't get me wrong, you can't always stop yourself from sending some negative messages, which is okay. But when you realize you're doing that, start sending some positive messages. Like, I'm going to pass my driving test. My driving instructor wouldn't take me for the driving test unless they believed that I was ready. I believe myself that I'm ready for the driving test. It's okay if I don't pass the driving test because I'll get another test using a cancellation app in the next month or so. And if I struggle, I can ask Josh and he'll help me. This signals the brain to say, get out of fight or flight mode and go back to calm mode. And finally, the third method of helping control our nerves. And a nice obvious symptom of when you start to feel panicky is you start to speed up. Everything's done a lot quicker. You start to try and change gear too quick. You're trying to go from second into third, but you end up in first. You end up trying to change gear at the wrong time. Or you accidentally pull out on someone because you're rushing. And we can't always stop ourselves from this beginning. But what we can do is recognize that we're beginning to speed up and that everything is becoming rushed and start sending messages to the brain to slow down. So how do we do this? Well, first of all, we have to recognize that we're starting to speed up. Then we have to forcibly control ourselves and begin to slow the process of everything down. This will then send messages up to the brain to say, we don't need to panic. We don't need fight or flight mode. We need calm and normal driving mode. Now, all of these techniques are really effective for anxiety and driving test nerves. They're very effective on their own individually, but if you do them all together, you're gonna level up. If this has helped you, please do share it with your friends and colleagues and help them as well. Don't forget to like the video. I am Josh, your driving instructor, and I am out. Boom.